If DC doesn't get its act together, and quickly, we will have no choice but to take federal control of the city and run this city how it should be run. President Donald Trump. All right, good morning. Welcome to yet another episode of the Liberty Dad Podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. I'm your host, DL, America's most objective libertarian. It's true, folks. You know how I know it's true? Because I said it. Why would I say it if it's not true? If you're tuning in live, thank you so much for giving me your time so early. All right. So normally, what I like to do on my 47 Weekly is talk about like multiple things. However, as I was preparing for this, I was like, well, this is interesting, and this is interesting. So I was putting the show together, and I was like, I think this one might take up the majority of the time. So I basically said, all right, let's just focus on this one, because I think there's some interesting things to talk about. Now, there are basically two broad elements to this story. There is the aspect of crime, and then there is the aspect of the legality and maybe the proper use of government. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with crime. So let's start with a cool video here. We're going to go to our Dad TV.
This is Liberation Day in D.C. and
that wasn't supposed to start just yet. So we're going to our Dad TV here. This is my new way of trying to keep myself under the radar when it comes to getting dinged on YouTube. Plus, I thought it kind of looked cool anyway. You know, because I remember having a TV, maybe not quite like this, but I do remember that big, huge Zenith TV that, took like 3 people to lift. You had to put it on a dolly just to move it across the room. So anyway, I thought it looked kind of fun. Be sure to give me your feedback on it. Tell me if it's too small or anything like that. For bigger stuff, I will use the old way, where I have it more on full screen. But for most things, I think we'll do it this way. Anyway, so let's see what Trump had to say and about Liberation Day.
This is Liberation Day in D.C. and we're going to take our capital back. We're taking it back under the authorities vested in me as the President of the United States. I'm officially invoking Section 740 of the District of Columbia Home Rule Act. You know what that is? And placing the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department under direct federal control, and you'll be meeting the people that will be directly involved with that. Very good people, but they're tough, and they know what's happening, and they've done it before.
All right, so there you have it. That's basically what he said. You can go watch the fuller video, the longer video. I find it kind of interesting because he's like, we're going to take this city back. Now, I understand that Trump talks the way that he talks. He uses hyperbolic language, all that good stuff. I also understand that in general, people talk how they talk. It's like we might say, man, that's the bomb. We're not really talking about an actual bomb, right? So I understand that. But I just think it's very interesting that we're using the phrase, we're taking the country back, because it sounds like somebody took it from us, right? But he's talking about criminals. And as we're going to see, like, the idea that when you think of somebody taking something back, then one of two things, like you gave them something and then you decided, no, I'm good. I actually would rather have that. Or you could look at it and you can say, well, you took this from me. Now I'm coming to take it back. Right? So like those are generally the two ways that we see that phrase. But neither of those actually really happened. Like, it's not like the federal government is like, you know what, we're going to give DC to, here's a gift. And then we say, you know what, I'd actually rather have that gift back. And then also nobody came in and stormed DC and took it, as we're going to see here in a moment. So I want to start with this article from Reason Magazine. And this actually is from their July 2024 issue. Now, one of the things that I love doing is whenever there's like some sort of controversy or anything, I like to look back and say, well, historically, how was this conversation? What was the conversation historically? So if we're talking about like crime, which we're going to kind of start with, then okay, what did crime look like last year, the year before that? Like, how were people talking about it? Because one of the things that I've found is that people will, an issue will get hot button. There'll be a flurry of content, people writing articles, people making videos, and they're trying to make their point. And a lot of times they narrow in on the more recent information. And so that doesn't really paint you a good picture, especially when history does play a role in the conversation, as it frequently does in politics, legislation, and so on and so forth. So we're going to take a look back here. I think I need to do one more thing here. Give me just a second. All right, so there we are. Okay, so let's get, there we go. Ooh, why is that what happened there? That's interesting. Give me a second here while I adjust. Oh, I see. I see what I did wrong. Okay, I clicked the wrong button here. There we go. That's mo better. All right, so this is, I'm going to zoom in so that you guys can see it too. All right, so this is from their July 2024 issue titled, What Caused the DC Crime Wave? So Reason Magazine acknowledged that there was a crime wave in July of 2024. Now, I don't know exactly when this was written. I don't know if they spent like a month writing it or whatever, but it came out in July of 2024. It says, don't blame criminal justice reform or lack of social spending for DC's crime spike. Blame government mismanagement. All right, we're off to a good start here. For libertarians, that tends to be our answer. Like, hey, you're not managing this. Now, here's where it starts to get a little interesting for some folks. This was written by Joe Bishop Henchman. If you don't know, he's the former LNC chair, the chair of the Libertarian Party. And he resigned after controversy. Now, a lot of people might say, DL, can this guy be trusted? Look, it's not the case that if somebody did something that's controversial or problematic in one area, that they're going to necessarily be wrong in another area. It's possible. But if you read the article, I think when I read it, I was like, despite the fact that I'm not a big fan of Joe Bishop Henchman, for various reasons that we don't need to go into right now, it's insider baseball, okay? I think the article was written well, and I think it makes some good points. They make their references, right? Like, that's really a big key when you check out the references. Do the references kind of, support what they're saying? Are they taking it out of context? So on and so forth. Okay, so that's what we have. So I'm going with this. Okay, I'm cool with it. So let's go down. Now, I'm not going to read the whole thing, and I've only highlighted a couple of spots because my highlighter, the highlighter tool that I use is a little bit wonky and doesn't always work as well. So I just kind of like highlighted a word just to keep me on track here. But here's what he says. Violent crime rose 39% in Washington, D.C. last year, including a 67% jump in robberies. Okay, so it said it rose 39% last year. So this is written in 2024. So we're looking at if it rose last year 39%, that would be 2023. So you're going to assume that it rose 39% from the prior year, from 2022, okay? Homicides increased a stunning 35%. Property crime rose 24%, with 3,756 motor vehicle thefts in 2022, becoming 6,829 in 2023. So see what I'm saying? Like, we're going from 2022 to 2023. The city's 911 system struggled to handle 1.7 million calls, more per capita than anywhere else in the country. The trend did not spare the powerful. In February of 23, an attacker in an apartment elevator grabbed Representative Angie Craig by the neck. In October, 3 masked gunmen carjacked Representative Henry Cellular? I don't know. I'm not sure how to say that last name. In the trendy Navy Yard neighborhood. And in February, a former D.C. election official, Mike Gill, was shot dead in his car while picking up his wife just off K Street. Business owners citywide deal with brazen thefts. This did not reflect a national trend. The rest of the country saw a 13% drop in homicides in 2023, a reduction evident in many major cities. New York down 11%, Chicago 13%, Los Angeles 16%, Atlanta 18%, Philadelphia 21%, Baltimore 25%. But in Washington, crime went up and up and up, peaking in summer of 2023 and now declining somewhat, but still elevated. Okay, so this is pretty interesting. So we scroll down a little bit more here. I'm going to skip past. You can go read it. It's in the show notes. I encourage you to go and read the whole thing. I want to focus on some interesting elements here. All right. So then down here it says, in the first decade of the 2000s, the U.S. Let me back up just a wee bit here. So this is under government mismanagement helped cause the spike. So this is now kind of like talking about like, okay, how did we get here? What happened? So we go down in the first decade of the 2000s. The U.S. attorney for D.C. prosecuted more than 70% of arrests. In 2016, the percentage began to slide downward, falling below 50% in 2021 and hitting 33% in 2022. After some attention was drawn to the decline, the number recovered a bit to a still low 44% in 2023. Felony prosecutions fell from more than 80% to about 50% in 2022. Then rose to 60% in 2023. The U.S. attorney declined to prosecute 58% of all arrests for theft in 2021 and 2022, which, as Joe Friday said, undermined the certainty of punishment for theft in D.C. Now, what is the point that I'm making here? I am kind of, if hopefully you picked up on it, the crime wave that they're talking about occurred over time. Okay, so like he goes back to the first decade of the 2000s. That's 2000 to 2010. So he's explaining, how did we get to 2024 where crime has risen, and he goes back 2 decades and says, okay, well, back here, we were prosecuting this many arrests. Then we seem to shift our prosecution. And that ends up basically sending a signal to criminals, hey, you can get away with things. So more people who are inclined to be criminals decide to do so because the cost goes down. Ultimately, this is an issue that has occurred over time. That is very, very important in understanding the entire situation. Now, this is kind of backed up by some media outlets, which we'll show you in just a moment here. So let me jump over to this other article by Reason as well. This one was written 2 days ago, or came out 2 days ago. Hostile takeover. Trump federalizes law enforcement and deploys National Guard in D.C. Despite an apparent drop in the city's violent crime, President Donald Trump announced a, quote, public safety emergency in D.C., deploying 800 of the city's National Guard and over 450 law enforcement officers. So we go down here. Let me skip to my, let's go here. There. All right, see if this sticks. All right, perfect. Didn't bounce. The D.C. National Guard, unlike its counterparts in the states, is directly under the control of the president. In Section 740 of the Home Rule Act gives the president the power under special conditions of an emergency nature to take control of the MPD. These services cannot extend beyond 48 hours unless the president notifies the chairman and the ranking minority members of the congressional committees that oversee the city. He must make this notification in writing, stating the reason for the extension and the anticipated duration. So, what are you picking up on? If you picked up on, hey, this is supposed to be a short-term thing, however, crime has risen and got to a terrible spot over at least a decade or more, now you see a mismatch in power, right? Because you've got things that have been happening in D.C. over many years, and then the president wants to come in and say, well, we're going to take our city back. Presumably he means from the criminals, right? Because that would be the most obvious interpretation of that. We're going to take it back from the criminals with the legal authority that we have to intervene on a short-term basis. You starting to see the problem here? Now, this is where it gets really interesting. While an MPD commander is currently under investigation for allegedly manipulating crime statistics, the data we have from MPD back up recent reports of crime decreasing nationwide. Data released Monday also indicated 26% decrease in violent crime year over year. All right, so now it's becoming unclear. Okay, like, okay, is crime going up or down? So let's take a look here. So now, just on this point of the MPD commander, here's an article. I'm not going to read through the article. I'm just going to point out. It says DC police commander suspended, accused of changing crime statistics. Police union says directive to change offense classifications comes from command staff. So now we have a situation in DC where crime has risen, and it was initially reported as the cause being over time, over some many of years. Then we have the president saying, I'm going to come in and take over control, and we're going to restore things, but he's only got a limited window under which to work with. Then we have this issue of, okay, well, how much can we trust the data? It looks like a police commander, at least one of them, was supposedly changing crime statistics, presumably to make them better, which if you read the article, that's what it says, right? So then we look over, well, what does MPD's website say? So we look over here. Let me scroll in. Let me move this around a little bit. Let me get this a little bigger. All right. So this is as of August 12, 2025. The statistics below reflect data entered into MPD's records management system as of 12 a.m. on the date above. These numbers are based on DC Code offense definitions and do not reflect Part 1 crime totals as reported to the FBI's National Incident-Based Reporting System, NIBIRS. This report should be considered preliminary in nature. The reports are subject to change due to subsequent determinations related to amendments in classification, unfounded cases, or changes in offense definitions. So now on top of all this, it's hard to even trust their data because they're like, well, we could change definitions, like things could change, and so that could alter the crime statistics. So it's like, the hell is going on in DC? Now, this is not out of the ordinary. This happens all the time with statistics. You look at it, and I'm just going to kind of make up some dates, but like you might look at some crime data in, say, 2020, and it might give you one perception of like a state, a city, the nation. And then in 2024, you might look at it and you might find out like, okay, well, they have changed the criteria under which they classify things. And so now this report might give you a totally different impression of things. And so then you're trying to compare the two reports and say, well, what's the difference between 2020 and 2024? And what it might look better or it might look worse. But the reality is you're not getting the most accurate picture, because you would have to dig in and say, okay, in 2020, things were classified this way. If they are classified this way in 2024, then what would the difference be? Or you have to really dig in and parse out the data if you're going to accept two different classifications and say, okay, how does this difference look? What is causing this difference? Why did you change this, right? And then it becomes, in my opinion, it becomes more of a headache. So when it comes to statistics, you're going to have to be careful. And this happens all of the time. And it makes things very difficult to understand. So let's take a look at some of their changes here. Okay, so from 2024. So homicide, they say it dropped 11%. Sex abuse dropped 50%. Right, now these are reports. Okay, so this doesn't necessarily mean like convictions and all that. Assault with a dangerous weapon dropped 20%. Robbery dropped 28%. Violent crime total dropped 60%. Burglary 19% drop. Motor vehicle theft, everybody basically stayed the same. Theft from auto 4% drop. 6% drop from theft. Okay, arson went up 33%. Property crime total dropped -4%. or dropped 4%. All crime total dropped 7%. So it's wild. Like, you had years of increase, and then all of a sudden, everything but arson drops. That just seems a little weird. Like that doesn't seem to make sense, especially if, as Joe Bishop Henchman himself pointed out, in the first decade of the 2000s, the U.S. Attorney for D.C. prosecuted more than 70% of arrests. In 2016, the percentage began to slide downward, falling below 50% in 2021. So, first decade through 2021, we go from prosecuting more than 70% of all the arrests to prosecuting fewer than 50%. So more than a 20-point percentage drop over about a decade or so of time, almost 2 decades. So you call it somewhere between 10 and 20 years, which ultimately, as he points out here, right here, it undermines the certainty of punishment for theft in D.C., right? So this, so you're undermining your own authority in D.C. Now, I told you a moment ago, I like to look back and check out headlines. So here's some interesting headlines here. All right, let's go ahead and read them, and maybe I'll figure out how to make them a little bit bigger so that you guys can see it if you're watching on a phone. But from Vox, January of 2024, how the nation's capital became an outlier on violent crime. Republicans blame Democrats for D.C.'s rise in violent crime. The reality is much more complicated. It always is, right? That's always the case. So then we go on to the next one here, and it says carjackings. This is from CNN, February of 2024. Carjackings, homicides, and robberies are stealing a sense of security across Washington, D.C. They have affected prominent politicians and regular residents alike. I'm not going to try to, it's cut off. Then it goes on, NBC News. As violent crime soars in Washington, D.C., Trump vows a federal takeover. This is February of 2024. Washington has legitimately become a national outlier on violent crime, making 2023 the city's deadliest in more than 2 decades. Then the nation's capital is suffering the worst crime wave in 21st century. Crime in Washington, D.C. is continuing to rise at alarming rates in the nation's capital. Small businesses, residents, and even sports teams. Right? This is from the House Committee on the Budget. This is from our own government. February 2026, back in 2024, last year. Right? But then all of a sudden, 5 months later, roughly almost 5-6 months later, we get a change in tune from our media. WTOP says what DC's police chief believes has led to a 33% reduction in violent crime. This is in July of the same year. So in February, we're like, oh my God, this is the worst ever. It's the worst in the 21st century. And then 5 months later, they're like, man, what happened? How'd we drop 33%? That's a good question. Let's see another one. Axios. Violent crime in D.C. sharply drops. August 2024. It's one of the steepest decreases among major U.S. cities. D.C. violence, this is from NBC4, Washington. D.C. violent crime is lowest in 30 years, as U.S. Attorney predicts further drops. Violent crime in D.C. is down 35%. This historic drop represents the lowest number of violent crimes in D.C. in 30 years. Then we go, Washington Post. Violent crime, including homicide and carjackings, drops in D.C. This is December of 2024. Most crime dropped below pre-pandemic levels, with the exception of homicide and carjackings, police statistics show. Oh, interesting. Last one. USA 9. Homicides in D.C. plummet 31% as overall crime drops in 2024. Crime is down in every category in 2024 after a particularly violent 2023. And this is December of 2024. This doesn't make any sense, right? Like, it doesn't follow that you can look back to the beginning of the 2000s, in 2024, you're looking back at the beginning of 2000s and say, we can see some changes over the decade that have led us to the point we are now, and talking about we have a serious problem, and then suddenly 6 months later, look at that. Crime is dropping like crazy. Okay, now it would make sense if, I don't know, El Salvador's Bukele came in and started just throwing people in jail left and right. Sure, that might make sense. But did that happen? Not from any reports that I saw. There was no heavy hand of government that I could identify. There doesn't seem to be any particular reason that would justify why over time you have this increase in crime, and then all of a sudden, and it's not like DC went and said, you know what, F it, we're getting rid of all of our gun laws. Like, that would be something significant. Something significant needs to happen if in 6 months you see something that significantly changes the environment, allegedly, where the environment took years to get there. You see the point that I'm making here? There is a real problem. Part of it is, how are we reporting this information, right? And I will argue, and I don't have any evidence to present to you, but I would argue that part of this this confusion is because you've got people jockeying for power, right? You've got Trump coming in. He's been saying ever since. You can go back and you can find quotes as early as like 2016 talking about law and order, enforcing police. He's very law and order. Like, for me, in my perspective, I basically think of Trump as he is somebody that would support a police state. Something that I would consider to be a police state, he would support it. And you can find comments to that effect from as far back as 2016. Okay? So I think this is very interesting. I think that you've got, Trump was saying like, hey, we're going to take over DC if we have to. And then DC is getting, they're like getting their act together, but then their act together may be misrepresenting some of the data, right? that maybe that's what it is. I don't know. I don't know, because there's nothing that's really firm that says, yes, I have confidence in this. This gives me confidence in the data that they're presenting. What I can have confidence in, despite the fact that I don't even like Joe Bishop Henchman, is that he goes back 20 years and he cites all of his sources. So I can go look at those sources and I could say, yeah, this article makes sense. I don't like you, but since I'm an objective libertarian, America's most objective libertarian, I have to say, I think he's correct. That yes, the way that the city's behaved itself over time has caused this increase in crime. And it doesn't just go away in 6 months, especially when you haven't done anything significant to make it go away. Because now Donald Trump is like, hey, we're federalizing the DC police. We're going to send in the National Guard. We're going to deal with this. So now the question becomes, well, wait a minute. Does he have the authority to do that? Right? Is that a good idea? That's where we are now. So let's take a look. Let's see here. Where's my next article? Oh, yeah, here we are. Let's go back to this. Get over. All right, so this is my Reason article. So we're going to go over here. Good article from Reuters. Can Trump take control of Washington to fight the city's crime? This is put out on August 12th. President Donald Trump has repeatedly threatened to put Washington, D.C. under full federal control to reduce crime, even as city officials stress crime is already falling. Okay, now again, I think the jockeying for power plays a role here. Donald Trump says, hey, get your act together or we're coming in. And then they're like, we are. Yeah, look, check out this data. Check out this data, right? Now, is it this case that I'm saying that the mayor, put out a statement and, told the police, hey, you do whatever you have to do to make this crime drop, like fake data? I don't think that was I don't think you're going to find any evidence to that, although you might. When it comes to politics, nothing really surprised me. But I'm going to give them the, I hate saying this, I really do, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt that there was no very unmistakable, clear directive to falsify data. Okay? Usually what ends up happening is they say, you figure this out and you make it happen. You know, you give me the data that I want, right? And they kind of leave it open-ended. And then someone's like, well, I got to do this. So let's change some classifications, or let's do this, or let's F it. Let's just fake it all together, right? Like I think that's generally how you're going to find that it plays out. So continuing on, while Trump does have some authority over the Capitol, city's police force, and National Guard soldiers, a full federal takeover would likely be blocked in court. Here is why. What does the Constitution say about control of D.C.? This is a great place to start. I wish we would. We're what? This is the third paragraph in, and they're like, what does the Constitution say? You know what? More news outlets need to start with that. Lead with that. What does the Constitution say? That's a great place to start. Now, I get it. Many of my libertarian peers aren't too terribly fond of the Constitution for more philosophical reasons. Not necessarily that they're lunatics. They just, they have deeper reasons. But hey, that's what we got to work with. And so we should start with that. The U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1787, provided for the creation of a federal capital district to serve as the permanent seat of government. The Constitution made clear, the Constitution made clear that Congress has complete legislative authority over the district, but Congress has historically delegated at least some of the day-to-day work of municipal government to other entities. How is D.C. governed? A federal law passed in 1973, known as the Home Rule Act, allowed city residents to elect a mayor and council who have some autonomy to pass their own laws. I see this as a good thing. Congress still has budgetary oversight over D.C., however, and can overturn local legislation. Not terribly fond of that, but I kind of understand it. D.C. is not intended to be a state, so it's not intended to necessarily have the full autonomy like a state. Congress did that most recently in 2023, voting to overturn changes to Washington's laws that lowered penalties for some crimes. Let me read that again. Congress did that most recently in 2023, voting to overturn changes to Washington's laws that lowered penalties for some crimes. So Washington changed their laws to lower penalties. Okay? Sounds like some mismanagement to me. This sounds exactly like what Joe Bishop Henchman was saying. Like, hey, the mismanagement started at home. Continuing on. What controls D.C. law enforcement? Democratic Mayor of Washington, Muriel Bowser, has authority over the city's Metropolitan Police Department, but the Home Rule Act allows the president to take control of the MPD for federal purposes during emergencies if, quote, special conditions of an emergency nature exist. A presidential takeover is limited to 30 days unless Congress votes to extend it through a joint resolution. Trump invoked this part of the Home Rule Act on Monday, saying in an executive order that there is a, quote, crime emergency in the city that necessitates federal management of the police department. Bowser has pushed back on Trump's claims of unchecked violence, saying the city is, quote, not experiencing a crime spike, unquote, and highlighting that violent crime hit its lowest level in more than 3 decades last year. Violent crime, including murders, spiked in 2023, turning Washington into one of the deadliest cities according to city police data. So in 2023, they became one of the deadliest cities in the country, which, as JBH, Joe Bishop Henchman, pointed out, occurred over many years. And then in 2023? Or we'll go back to that. What was it, 2023? Yeah, 2023, Congress overturned some of their legislation to reduce penalties. So Mayor Bowser, is it Bowser or Bauer? Bowser. Okay. Mayor Bowser, interesting last name. Mayor Bowser is like, look, we got the lowest crime in 30 years, despite the fact that they were trying to lower the penalties for it. It's not adding up. Okay. Let's see here. Where are we? Continue on. Violent crime, including murder, spiked in 2023. Okay. However, violent crime dropped 35% in 2024, according to federal data, and it has fallen an additional 26% in the first 7 months of 2025. That's interesting. Trump has broad control of the D.C. National Guard's 2,700 soldiers and airmen. They report directly to the president, unlike counterparts in other states and territories. Trump said on Washington he was deploying 800 National Guard troops to Washington. So, can Trump federalize D.C.? It is highly unlikely. To exert full federal control of D.C., Trump would need Congress to repeal the Home Rule Act. Such a repeal would require 60 votes in the U.S. Senate, where Trump's Republican Party has a 53 to 47 advantage. Democrats have been supportive of home rule for D.C. and are not expected to cross party lines to endorse Trump's vision. But there are ways Trump can exert more influence over the district without fully taking it over. Trump in recent months has directed federal law enforcement agencies, such as the FBI, to increase the police presence in Washington. Trump has broad authority to reallocate FBI personnel, and in recent months, FBI agents around the country have been given temporary assignments to help with immigration enforcement. Trump also signed an executive order in March to make D.C., quote, safe and beautiful. By the way, some elements of D.C. already are beautiful. Just point that out. Establishing a task force to increase police presence in public areas, maximizing immigration enforcement, and expedite concealed carry licenses. Okay. The expedite concealed carry licenses, I will always support. It is in the Constitution. We are talking about the Constitution. So I'm good with that. And my read of the Constitution, the Second Amendment, says you can have whatever weapon that you want, especially my read of history as well, whatever weapon you want to defend yourself. And if you want to conceal it, you can conceal it. If you want to open carry, you can open carry. That's my read of the Second Amendment. So I will, of all things, I will absolutely support expediting concealed carry licenses. Now, personally, I prefer concealed carry because I would rather a criminal walk into Walmart and see 50 people and wonder which one of these people or all of them have a firearm that might shoot me. That's my preference, beside the point. Can Trump evict D.C.'s homeless population? Trump has said homeless people must move out of Washington without offering specifics of a plan to accomplish this. Are homeless people the actual problem? I suspect they're part of the problem. Some homeless people are going to go steal and maybe do some vandalizing. But whenever I walk in a city that has a lot of homeless people, I usually see homeless people doing one of three things. Walking around, either quietly or saying weird stuff, sleeping, or smoking something, a cigarette, a joint. I was just up in Asheville a couple weekends ago, and walked by some homeless dude was just sitting on the sidewalk, with his stuff and just smoking a joint right as we walked by, and I was like, well, all right. So I don't really know how this is going to go toward is there a direct correlation between homeless and this spike in crime that has occurred over the years? I'm going to suspect not. I'm going to make our capital safer and more beautiful than it ever was before, Trump said on Truth Social. The homeless have to move out immediately. We will give you places to stay, but far from the Capitol. So our president is a nice little NIMBY. The federal government owns much of Washington's parkland, so the Trump administration has legal authority to clear homeless encampments in those areas, like President Joe Biden did while in office. But the federal government cannot force people to move out of the city because they lack shelter, legal experts say. All right, so apparently he's going to deal with the homeless problem, and then bam, all the crime is going to go down. So ultimately, where do I land on all of this? Okay, that's really the question that you're probably asking yourself, right? In fact, one of the comments here straight away, let me get to my live chat there. That Liberty Lady says, I see a lot of bootlicking Republicans who are welcoming this federalization of D.C. I could act surprised, but I'm not. So I guess I need to tread carefully here, don't I? Actually, I don't. So here's where I stand on this. I think that I oppose it. Why? Because it sounds crazy, right? Like, DL, there's all this crime. Why would you oppose this? Number one, first and foremost, I always support the idea of local rule, whatever you want to call it. Here in Florida, we like to call it home rule. You might call it something somewhere else, something different somewhere else. For me, I want the citizens locally to decide what happens where they live. Right here in Jacksonville, there is a vibe. People think things differently than they do, say, in Miami. There's just a different vibe, and there's a different there's a different cohort of people. Right, you've got a lot of Cubans, a higher percentage of Cubans in Miami, whereas you don't have nearly that level here in Jacksonville. There are some, of course, but there's not nearly as many, right? And so they're going to have a different vibe because they have different experiences. And the city itself is different because there's different industries, so on and so forth. So for me, I look at it and say just the difference between, say, Jacksonville, Orlando, and Miami. They're all vastly different cities with vastly different things going on, vastly different populations. Yes, we're all Americans for the most part, but we still have a different vibe. And so we should be allowed to rule ourselves. And so therefore, Jacksonville may say we support certain things that would not be supported in Orlando, that may be supported somewhat in in Miami, and then any variation thereof. Okay. So for me, I'm a big local rule kind of person. The other reason for that is it's a lot easier for citizens to have a say. It's harder. Think of it this way. It's hard if the federal government were to impose something on Jacksonville. Well, guess who's involved in basically holding the federal government accountable? Everybody in the United States. So therefore, you might have Jacksonville that says, hey, we don't like this. But everybody else outside of Jacksonville who doesn't have to deal with it, they might say, but we do, right? And so we end up becoming ruled by mob authority. That's effectively what it ends up being. So I support local rule. And then same thing for the states. Hey, what happens in Alaska? Like, what is that? Why do I have a say in that? Beyond the Constitution, why would I have a say? I don't, okay? I could argue and I mean, a real say in terms of like influence. Of course, we have the First Amendment, so I can say whatever I want. I could talk about every other city and say, these are terrible ideas, here's why, so on and so forth, and I'm free to do that. But I think there should be a limit on what influence I can exert in somebody else's community. So I'm always going to fall on local rule. Why don't I say always? I will most of the time fall on local rule. When I don't, most of the time, probably all of the time, I haven't really thought this one through, but probably all the time, it will be a constitutional issue. And I will say, no, we have a constitution. We have to abide by that. Second point, any interference from federal government should be limited to its absolute most necessity. And I envision two ways that happens. Number one, by request. Number two, when your local government has undeniably, and here's the key word, rapidly lost control. Okay. Now I didn't say rapidly just so I could, this wasn't me choosing some clever word to get around, and kind of, take the data and say, okay, how can I make my point? Here's why I say rapidly. Because there might be a time when something happens and the city or a state, but more than likely a city, simply doesn't have time to make the proper changes, or they don't have the resources to make to basically regain control. So let's think of a contrived example. Let's say we're a border town and all of a sudden you've got cartels just flooding across the border and just terrorizing a whole city out of nowhere, and there's pandemonium. Well, in that particular case, I would say, hey, maybe it would be appropriate for that state to come in and say, all right, we're taking over this city for the purposes of dealing with this threat that has just basically come in. In that particular case, since you're talking about a foreign entity coming over, I would probably even support the federal government saying, okay, you've got a foreign entity coming across the border, terrorizing this town. They've rapidly lost control. And, what we're going to do is we're going to bring in our troops. We're going to bring in our resources. We're going to kick these busters out of here. We're going to deal with this. And then as soon as we get this under control, we're handing it right back to the city as is, right? That's where I would say. And then by request kind of is obvious. Maybe something happens. Maybe California has some wildfires that get really out of control. Maybe they have a huge earthquake, and it's beyond their resources. And they reach out and they say, hey, federal government, we could use a little assistance here. Things have gone wayward. In those particular cases, again, by request or an undeniable and rapid loss of control, those two situations, I would support federal or state interference. Outside of that, I don't. Why? What about the crime and the citizens? As always, as I repeat, Ben Franklin came out of the Constitutional Convention and he was asked, what have you given us? And he said, a republic, if you can keep it. America is an experiment in self-governance. A good one, in my opinion. It is supposed to be for the people, by the people. It is designed explicitly to prevent a dictatorship of any form. We have to maintain our own governance, period. And that only happens if people prioritize, in this order, from local to federal. So if and when, oh, you know what? I didn't change let me fix that. All right. So if and when, like, the residents of D.C. get tired of the crime, then they deal with their local government. They can raise hell. They can throw out their mayor, who's been there for like a decade. They can throw her out and say, hey, you're not doing the job. We're dying over here, like quite literally. Crime is out of control. You're a crappy mayor. We're getting rid of you, and we're putting in somebody that's going to do the job right. That's what should happen. Because if you don't, then you ruin the American experiment, the American experience. I probably should put it that way. I don't really like saying experiment. I mean, it kind of is because it was very unique when it was designed, but the idea here is self-governance only works if you self-govern, if you participate. And if you're going to allow your city to go down the tubes, then you ultimately, at the end of the day, today's savior can quickly become tomorrow's tyrant. And in the way that our system works, especially right now, precedent holds a lot of weight. So if you allow the federal government to start coming in and, imposing its rules, you get a justification here, then later you might say, okay, well, this justification is a little different than the last one. So therefore, we're just going to just a little bit more. It's, to make a crude joke, it's just the tip, but for government. And so the only way that we protect ourselves as an entire country is to insist on local rule, which means citizens have to be engaged. And if that means that you have to suffer a little bit until you get your act together, then so be it. Because over here in Florida, I don't want to set precedent in other states or in Washington, D.C. I don't want to set precedent where we've allowed the federal government to interfere and they keep encroaching a little bit more and a little bit more. And then eventually one day I wake up and they're encroaching here in Florida. That is a constitutional issue. So I want to make sure that we hold to the Constitution, which was designed for local rule. And I think we've already exceeded far past the proper point of that. So as far as I'm concerned, does it sound harsh to say, do I want DC residents to suffer? No, I don't want them to suffer. But like any good dad, sometimes you got to feel the consequences of your behavior or your inaction. That's the way that reality works. Sometimes the consequences have to come your way. You have to experience them so that you will know this is not good or this is what I need to do. And it happens in all kind of areas, but it's especially important in government because, again, today's savior can be tomorrow's tyrant. All right. Now, you might say, well, DC is just kind of like this one example. Let me point out something to you. Past incidents. Washington, D.C., June of 2020, the George Floyd protest. Portland, Oregon, July of 2020, George Floyd protest. Multiple cities in July of 2020, Operation Legend. Los Angeles, California, June 2025, immigration protest. Washington, D.C., August 2025, crime emergency. The southern border states, 2025, anti-immigration operations. You know what all those are? Those are instances where the federal government intervened. All of them. We are racking them up, folks. The federal government keeps adding them up. And you can make an argument, say, okay, well, maybe immigration, and I know some of my peers will say, hey, immigration is not in the Constitution. But somebody might make an argument and say, okay, well, immigration is one thing. Okay, fine. But protest? Is that really something like that the federal government should involve themselves in? Or should it be the state? Now, if you want to say, okay, well, maybe the protests in Washington that get out of control, the federal government gets involved because they don't have statehood. Okay, fine. If we tell all the other states, you got to figure it out. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is we keep finding more reasons, right? We've got immigration issues. Then we get, okay, well, here's these protests. And now we're like, oh, here's some crime emergencies that we have to deal with, right? Except for the crime emergencies have happened over decades. Same thing with immigrants, actually, as well. If you're going to make that argument, that's happened over decades as well, right? The protests are actually the only thing that you could say happened in the spur of the moment that you could argue and say, okay, this is like a short-term loss of control. Like, you might be able to make that argument. I would say that I did not see where the police really went out and said, we're going to put an end to this. Oh my God, we're overwhelmed. I didn't see that. So as far as I'm concerned, they didn't actually employ their own resources to their fullest capability. So for me, I fall on, and so I'm going to stay in the good graces here. I oppose this because DC needs to get their act together, and it's not the federal government's job to come in and say, hey, you don't have your act together, so we're going to come in and do it for you. And to be frank, I'm not even convinced that they can. If this is a problem that has been brewing over years, many years, and then you have further other problems where it's not even clear what the data says, right? I mean, it seems pretty clear that there is a problem with crime, but it's not clear, to what percentage it's going up or down, because we can't trust some of the numbers, right? So this is a problem over time. This is a problem that needs to be handled internally. And if they don't handle it internally, the federal government in 30 days is not going to be sufficient. They might be able to come in and stop a few things, but violent crime happens kind of sporadically in a sense, right? It's not like a protest that's ongoing. You have a protest, it starts, it turns into a riot, right? We can all watch it and see that it's happening. We can predict if people are vandalizing a building over there, this building over here might be next. We can predict those. You can't necessarily do it. You can't go, I bet you a murder is going to happen on this block tomorrow. You can't say that. It could happen, and it might not happen. It could happen on the block next, one block over. It could happen, 4 blocks over. Or it could not happen at all in the next week. You don't know. So for me, I look at it, I say, there's no way that the federal government can come in and in 30 days clean up something that has built itself up over many years. Not possible. So again, this is reaching out to like federal government to say, come and save us. And then it's not clear exactly how they're going to do that or whether or not we're going to get honest information. Will the government come in and say, okay, here's what we did. Here's how it's going to, here's how it worked. Here's how we were able to dramatically reduce crime. I don't think so. They seem to be having a problem with transparency lately. So I don't know. I'm not really convinced. I think we got a lot of problems here. But I think ultimately it comes down to Washington needs to take care of itself. Period. Or D.C., I mean. Not Washington, the state. D.C. So that's where I land. All right, folks. Let's check out some comments here. Let's see what you guys are saying. If you guys agree with me, disagree with me, whatever. That Liberty Lady. Oops. Let's go back to the live chat there. Boom. That Liberty lady says, so in other words, taxpayers will be giving the homeless a place to stay. Seems like it. They're not really addressing the homelessness. They're just like, get out of here. Yeah, did you see the South Park episode where Cartman gets on a bus and he sings, to the tune of California, and he's like, California has love for the homeless or something like that, and basically they're getting all the homeless rounded up from South Park to move over to California. I mean, that's kind of what they're doing. They're just kind of shipping people out. That doesn't solve the homeless problem. And if the homeless are part of the crime problem, it doesn't solve the crime problem either. It just pushes the crime somewhere else for somebody else to deal with. Let's see. Government's very good at that. They're very good at kicking the can down the road. They're very good at making it somebody else's problem. Let's see. Keith says the party is their model. It works for them, so it should work for the nation, right? If only people would drop their party affiliation unless they had a good reason. Yeah, I think there's something to be said there that a lot of people are engaging in party politics. Like, I don't really, as a libertarian, I have more fondness for the Libertarian Party and its members, sort of. It's another conversation. But I generally have more fondness than I do the other two parties. But at the end of the day, whoever has the best idea is the one that has the best idea. Let's see. Yes, local. Federalization is the complete opposite. Absolutely. And, again, if D.C. doesn't get their act together, and let's say Washington comes in and they do manage to clean stuff up, it's only going to be a temporary fix. And nobody's really identifying what is the problem in D.C. Right now, Joe Bishop Henchman in his article kind of points out, and he says, hey, one thing for sure seems to be that they're not punishing, they're not prosecuting crimes. And so people know, hey, there's a good chance I'll get away with it. So that's one thing, but what are some other elements? Does changing the definition of offenses, or does any legislation that reduces penalty, in the first place, what role do those play? I think they play a role. And until DC gets its act together, they're going to continue to have problems. They just might delay some of them later. Let's see what else we got here. You know what? I think we'll end on this one here. Just says, good advice, Liberty Dad. Isn't it always good advice from me? All right. I'm going to get out of here, folks. Thank you so much for joining me today. Apologies that I only did one topic, but I felt this one was worth digging into because it was very interesting. So we will see you guys tomorrow. Thank you for watching, and I hope you found this episode informative and inspiring. Be sure to catch me Monday through Friday, 7:30 a.m. for an informed discussion on politics and culture. Make sure that you're subscribed to my YouTube channel, or if you prefer my Rumble channel, you can go to youtube.libertydad.com, or you can go to rumble.libertydad.com. While you are there, let me know how I'm doing by leaving me a comment. Remember, if you're a champion of liberty, your business is people and your product is liberty. I want you to have a great week. Catch you next time. But for now, I'm out.